Fáilte Rasha Kharja, you're very welcome to part two of this episode, Skorts, Shorts and the Three Stripe Affair on Undercover Irish. It's Misha Olin, I'm your host. And when we last spoke, we left it with the story in turmoil. Cork's footballers were en masse suspended. There was battles on the pitch between Cork and Kerry. There was battles off the pitch between Cork and the Cork County Board. And on this week's episode, we're going to look at the continuing fallout of that, the battle between O'Neill's and Adidas on the streets in terms of fashion and indeed in the courts, the battle between native industry and foreign branding, between the GAA's grassroots identity and the growing influence, the kind of conflict with the growing influence of global trends. And just when you think that it's all ancient history, we fast forward to today, an issue that started in 2023, where Camogie players have been rebelling against Skorts in favour of shorts, in favour of parity with their Gaelic Athletic Association, their common Lucas Gael counterparts, male counterparts, and indeed ladies football counterparts. Same sports, different generations, similar questions. Let's get straight to it. Arrigling. So let's pick up a Kharja in 1977. Cork GAA was still reeling from the fallout of the Three Stripe Affair. And at this time, all these controversies were still known as affairs. Watergate, while it was previous to that, still hadn't got the influence of Gate on every scandal. But the Three Stripe Affair had left Cork reeling. After the Munster football final, as discussed in the last episode, the county board had taken the drastic step of suspending all senior footballers who had worn Adidas branded gear seen as a challenge to the GAA's commitment to Irish manufacturers and amateur values and the amateur ethos. But this sweeping punishment created a bit of a dilemma for Cork and in Cork, because two of the suspended footballers, a certain Jimmy Barry Murphy and Brian Murphy, were also dual players. They were key members of the county senior hurling panel. And that panel, well, it had a real shot at winning the All-Ireland in 1977. And as everybody knows, in Cork, hurling is a religion. And the previous year, of course, in 1976, Cork had added yet another hurling All-Ireland to the roll of honour. So there was a real feeling in Cork that this team could go on and win two in a row. And as it subsequently turned out, go for three in a row. So faced with these problems, the county board drew a curious distinction. The suspensions would only apply to football. Now this allowed Jimmy Barry Murphy and Brian Murphy to continue playing with the hurling panel. It was a delicate balancing act, but it worked. In fact, it was vital because Cork won the Munster Championship that year against Clare. They won by 5 points on the day, and Jimmy Barry Murphy scored 2 goals equivalent to 6 points, meaning the difference on that day. They went on subsequently in September to win the All-Ireland final and make it 2 in a row with victory over Wexford. And as the team were welcomed back to Cork and the parade began in earnest around the South Mall, one particular supporter unveiled a flag which read, "Our stars in stripes," a pun and a play on the current unveiling controversy. And I'm struck by how much, at the time, Three Stripes International, Adidas, were determined to keep courting Cork. I suppose it probably made sense in the sense that if they wanted to break the GAA market in particular, Cork as a power in both games, both hurling and football, and also being a county with a large population centre and a large city, it made perfect sense. Looking through the newspaper archives, I see a presentation from Three Stripes International Adidas to the Cork players, but it clearly states for their personal use, in other words, not to be worn as part of match day kit or official kit. It's to be used for their personal possession only, their own personal enjoyment. And it strikes me almost like when you see in the newspaper now that someone caught in possession of illegal drugs, for example, and it stipulated that it was for personal possession or personal use only. It's a kind of a funny thing that they would stipulate that this is for personal use only. But Cork GAA stayed strong on their principle in terms of practical patriotism. And somewhat ironically, this led Adidas to court a different county. And at the time, obviously, Kerry were flying high in football. And it's somewhat ironic that throughout the 80s and early 90s, Kerry were associated, certainly off the field, with the Adidas jersey. And Adidas became, at various stages, a direct sponsor of Kerry GAA. This is ironic given the fact that Kerry were on the other side of the field in terms of the three-stripe affair when it broke out in 1976. But not everybody in Kerry was happy with this arrangement. But in Kerry too, controversy would rear its head. The Kerryman newspaper on the 20th of September 1985 has the following article, quote, "The official Adidas picture of the Kerry football team, taken in Austin Stacks Park, Tralee last Sunday, will have one notable exception from the lineup. Selector, Joe Keohane. The former Kerry great refused to stand in for this picture because of his disapproval of the Kerry GAA's association with a foreign company. This is the latest development in the, quote, official team picture saga, quote, which has gone on since the drawn All-Ireland semi-final when only 13 Kerry players posed for the cameras. In the replay, it looked as if the entire panel decided to face the cameras. Kerry GAA officials have been angered in the past because of what they feel is the exploitation of the Kerry team." The article goes on to state, quote, "This year, Kerry officials decided to reserve the official team photograph for Adidas, who have reportedly contributed £10,000 to GAA coffers. Joe Keohane's decision to opt out of the Adidas picture stems from his concern about the high level of unemployment in this county and this country. He was convinced that Kerry GAA was effectively endorsing foreign industry. However, when he was contacted this week by the Kerryman newspaper, Mr. Keohane refused to comment on the matter." And, this goes right to one of the many layers in this particular story, or this particular part of the story. At this particular time, as mentioned in the first podcast, Ireland is between two stools in the sense that it has opened up to the world in terms of the economy, and that's the government policy. And there's this combat or conflict between the idea of that this could cost Indigenous jobs and Indigenous industry. And there's this kind of feeling that what's coming from the outside will be in competition with what was here already. And at this point, it's important to acknowledge and remember that, of course, sportswear was made in Ireland for generations prior to Adidas and Three Stripes International's entry to the market. O'Neill's is probably the most iconic one of all. Commonly known as O'Neill's Irish International Sports Company Limited, it's Ireland's oldest and largest manufacturer of sportswear, and its legacy dates back to 1918. It was founded by Charles O'Neill in Dublin, and the company began by producing Gaelic footballs and slitters in a small factory off Capel Street in Dublin. In the 1960s, they really made their move into the manufacture of playing kits for GAA, and by 1974, they had opened a second production facility in Strabane in County Tyrone. And since then, that has become its main manufacturing hub. In 1987, their operations moved from Capel Street site and Walkinstown Avenue in Dublin. And for so long, O'Neill's has been regarded and renowned for a deep association with Irish sports, not simply GAA, but probably especially GAA. And they've supplied kits to clubs and counties for years and still do. Now, obviously, they've also been involved in rugby, soccer, basketball, cricket, boxing, athletics, and so on. But this company are obviously spooked by Adidas's introduction or incursion into the Irish market and particularly the GAA market. And it's funny, around this time in the newspaper archives again, you start to see a turf battle breaking out over the iconic three stripes, because while Adidas at this point are world renowned for the three stripes, famous soccer World Cups, football World Cups, you look back and you see the three stripe football boots. In Ireland, O'Neill's had been using the three stripes on tracksuits and on sportswear, and now they're very much making that known in the newspaper archives. We see this in the advertisements of the time and of the day. And we were speaking about social histories in the last podcast, and this is a time when there's a change happening in social history in terms of fashion, because sportswear, while it was probably seen up to a certain point as only to be worn in the act of sport or training, sportswear is now becoming a fashion item in the 60s and the 70s, and indeed the 80s. People are wearing tracksuits and sports gear, from jerseys to polo shirts, as everyday wear, as fashion wear. And all sporting companies can see this and tailor their adverts accordingly. In the case of Adidas, you see them responding, I suppose, to O'Neill's. O'Neill's are out there and they're saying, here's an advert from the Sunday Press. Tracksuits is the headline. O'Neill's three-stripe tracksuits, sizes 28 to 44 in navy, royal, green, red, from £9.25. Brushed nylon tracksuits, assorted colours, £6. Presumably the cheaper option don't have the three stripes, the iconic three stripes. So O'Neill's are stating here in their adverts they're staking claim to ownership over the three stripes. But of course, Adidas would have something to say about that too. An Adidas advert around the same time leads with the Adidas and the famous symbol logo associated with them. And here's the quote, top sports stars wear Adidas. And here they really double down. The quote is gear, right, with the distinctive three stripes. So they've got the distinctive three stripes lashed onto their advert, and they say underneath, Adidas football, boots, tracksuits, kit bag, the mark of a winner. And in those examples, they appear in opposition to each other in terms of the advertisement. But there's a brilliant one I found here in the Sunday Press, Sunday, December the 9th, 1979. And it's an advert for Johnny Giles Sports. Interesting, I didn't know Johnny Giles had a sports shop at the time. But he's got shops, apparently, according to this, in Dundrum Shopping Centre, Douglas Shopping Centre, Wilton Shopping Centre, and above in Galway. And they appear side by side here. In terms of the Adidas footwear that's advertised and on display, you have the Mitra, the screw-in studs, the Beckenbauer Super, and a trainer or runner that we would still be familiar with today, the ROM, R-O-M, then available for the princely sum of £15 or $14.95. And right next to them you have Adidas tracksuits, O'Neill's three-stripe tracksuits, again similar sizes, similar colours, for £9.25. So they appear head to head next to each other in adverts up and down the newspapers at the time, both of them staking claim to the iconic three stripes. And of course, it wasn't very long before the battle on the streets in terms of fashion, the battle in the newspapers in terms of adverts, went up the steps to the courts, where Adidas attempted to get an injunction against O'Neill's for using and manufacturing clothes with the three stripes. And in the Irish Independent in 1980, the 21st of the 5th, 1980, you have an article which states the following, quote, a West German sports firm was accused by a High Court judge yesterday of trying to get exclusive use of a three-stripe symbol for advertising purposes through a court action against an Irish firm. And the firm's action against Dublin sports goods manufacturer Charles O'Neill and Company Limited of Capel Street was dismissed with costs when the judge found that O'Neill's had been experimenting with the stripe designs for many years and that they had never attempted to pass their goods off as those of Adidas. In his judgment, Mr. Justice McWilliams said, "The emphasis on the importance of the television both in argument and in evidence on behalf of Adidas, and the lack of any real indication of confusion suggested to him that Adidas were not so much concerned about present confusion as about to obtain symbol which would advertise their goods in a form acceptable to those in control of the top class sporting events." Adidas had claimed that their products had been distinguished since 1952 by distinctive use of a 3 parallel stripe. They had alleged that O'Neill's had begun to manufacture products with an identical or similar 3-stripe design and had created confusion in the minds of the public as to the origin of the O'Neill's goods. O'Neill's, in their defence, denied that they had ever passed off their goods as those of Adidas or that they intended to do so. So we see there Adidas taking to the courtroom in an attempt, I suppose, to gain ownership entirely over the 3 stripes, the iconic 3 stripes brand, and O'Neill's defending themselves and winning the judgment. But of course, it wouldn't be the last controversy in Gaelic games in terms of sportswear. People will recall the Cork hurling team protesting during the league final against Kilkenny a number of years back by wearing their socks low and their jerseys outside of their shorts, demanding recognition for the GPA at the time. And there have been other incidents as well. And the current controversy, which prompted me to look back on the 3 stripes debacle and do the podcast last week, has in the interim been resolved. Because yesterday at a special congress, the Camogie Association voted to allow their players to wear shorts. And in many ways, it probably derailed the plan for this particular episode, but it does show you that history is happening all around us, day by day, day by day. History, in a sense, is quite literally what happened this morning, or in this case, what happened yesterday. But it does bring forward an obligation on us to look at those who make change, who create change. And in this particular phase of the demand for equality for Camogie players, the players of inter-county Camogie teams deserve an awful lot of credit for pushing this issue and taking a stand, to the point that, regrettably, the players of Cork and Waterford had their match this year postponed, which I think was a shocking indictment, really, in terms of players and in terms of lack of recognition of players. You know, you think about these players and they have to peak at a certain time, they have to train in a certain way, and simply because they were due to protest, the match was pulled from under them. But nevertheless, the issue has been resolved. But it is important to give credit in circumstances like this to those who got the ball rolling. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say those who got the sliotar rolling in this case. And in this case, in the modern era, certainly, massive credit has to go to Tomás McCurtains GAA club in London, particularly their Camogie players. Tomás McCurtains GAA club was founded in 1920, named obviously after Tomás McCurtain, martyred Lord Mayor of Cork City, shot dead in Cork City by Crown occupying forces. But it was this club, or the players of this club, who took a stand in 2023. In a statement issued on Saturday, the 11th of March, 2023, it said, quote, "Tomás McCurtains Camogie Club introduces shorts to the team's kit on an official basis in a bid to move the sport forward, place the traditional skort in the archives of history, and calls for the Camogie Congress to change the rules on skorts ahead of the vote on March the 31st. Now, this was obviously 2 years ago. He continued, Tomás McCurtain is responding to its players. In January 2023, the team unanimously came to a decision to support a campaign in favour of the shorts as a staple in the Camogie uniform. Players have had enough of discomfort and impracticality. They need to focus on their game. The club is in its 8th season and boasts 2 teams across senior and intermediate levels. They at the time carried out a survey, and their key findings were that 82% of the players preferred to wear shorts rather than skorts. This, they claimed, was a barrier to the sport. This was a further quote. The skort is proving a barrier for people accessing the sport. Deemed uncomfortable, unflattering, chaff-inducing, patronising are repeated statements from those surveyed. Shorts are fit for function and performance. Skorts are not. Findings cite that people were put off playing the sport because of it. They were also joined by intercounty players at the time, like Niamh Rockett and Grace O'Brien, who supported them, and they made a call to action at the time. And great credit has to go to them in terms of pushing the envelope a little bit, and Sean Connolly in particular, who was listed in terms of media inquiries at the time and spoke on the media at the time as a representative of the campaign, for pushing this forward and for taking a stand and bringing Camogie very much into alignment with ladies football and hurling. So it's important, I think, for when the prevalence of common sense happens. In this case, unfortunately, it had to happen at the end of a campaign where players stood up and backed themselves and demanded equality and indeed choice. And it's important to remember those people and praise those people who, as I said, got the sliotar rolling on this one. Now, while common sense has belatedly prevailed, it is important to remember the social history of clothes or clothing, not simply in terms of sports, as a method of control and a method of conservatism. And when this controversy grew up again, a friend of mine, Pat Manning, big shout out to Pat, sent me on a newspaper article from the Southern Star, September, way back in 1935. The headline is Girls in Shorts. Subheading, Condemnation by West Cork Priest. And the article goes as follows. In the course of a powerful sermon on the Gospel of the Day at 12 o'clock Mass in Dunmanway on Sunday, Reverend C. Creed CC said he noticed young girls wearing shorts when cycling through the town during the week. Such girls were a disgrace to their sex and ought to be ashamed of themselves. Parents are bound to exercise better supervision over their children and not allow their daughters out in such scandalous fashion. And if they appeared again in such disgraceful attire, they deserved to be kicked off the streets. So, a historian I was listening to or reading recently said on a podcast that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. You know, it was hard not to draw a line from a fairly extreme thing that was said there in 1935. It would have been probably deemed to be a centrist view at the time, through to a situation in 2025 where female athletes had to go to such extreme circumstances, jeopardising and endangering their own inter-county careers, you could say, in order for common sense to prevail and for the clothing that they wear on the sporting field to match what they train in. So these are the kind of social histories that I think are very interesting, that arise out of current controversies and sometimes give us a thread that we can pull to go right back through the decades and see things pop up again and again and again. So Sinead Kharja for episode 4. It's been an extremely enjoyable couple of weeks, I have to say. I hope you've enjoyed this particular podcast today. I hope it's brought you a little bit of escapism and maybe you've enjoyed or learned something from it. Could I ask you, Kharja, if you've enjoyed any of the podcasts, please share, please subscribe. You might leave me a review. It would be very much appreciated. I'd like to thank everyone who's sent me an old message or reached out. It's been an extremely enjoyable experience and I really appreciate people reaching out for comment or feedback. So gurv mila mahagwiv a Corja. I was massively struck by the response to episode 1, which centred around the language around Gaeilge. I'm currently working on a number of those, so if you enjoy that one, there's a couple on the way. Taidig Chacht, they're on the way a Corja. And like I said, gurv mila mahagut asop ve'inin at lum. Thank you so much for tuning in, for listening, and Berigi Bua Corja agus Slán Gafol.